but it wasn't actually Jesus that was crucified at all, and that it could well have been someone else.
Yeah, that's true. The Quran actually says in chapter 4, verses 157 to 158, it says this: "And because of their saying, we slew the Messiah Jesus, son of Mary, Allah's messenger. They slew him not, nor crucified, but it appeared so to them. And lo, those who disagree concerning it are in doubt thereof. They have no knowledge thereof, save pursuit of a conjecture. They slew him not for certain, but Allah took him up unto himself. Allah was ever mighty, wise." Well, that Quranic verse could be interpreted in a number of ways. Most Muslims are taught that it only looked to everyone like Jesus was crucified, but Allah somehow intervened to substitute somebody else at the last minute, so that it just appeared that it was Jesus who was crucified. Now, Muslims are taught that Jesus was a prophet, and as such, God could not possibly allow one of his prophets to suffer something as shameful as crucifixion. And because Islam is a coercive, controlling religion, Muslims are actually not allowed to question what their imam says, what their religious leaders say. In Christian cultures, however, there is freedom for historical inquiry, and the question as to whether or not Jesus really was crucified can be subjected to critical analysis. And all the evidence from both Christian and non-Christian sources is that Jesus actually was definitely crucified.
Okay. Well, some people have the view that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. I mean, maybe he was so sort of badly injured that he passed out through the pain, maybe then to reawaken later on and then before appearing to the disciples. Again, some Muslims believe that view.
Yeah, that's true. Some Muslims who belong to the Ahmadiyya sect claim that Jesus swooned on the cross and later revived. Now, the Ahmadiyya sect is regarded as a heretical sect by most mainstream Muslims. It's actually persecuted in most Islamic countries, that sect, although, of course, they are free to operate in this country. And they say, like some other people have proposed this as well, that Jesus just swooned on the cross. Ahmadiyya Muslims say he then went to Kashmir in search of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and they have a shrine there which they claim is where he is buried today, although there's no proof of that. There's no body being shown. Now, like all claims, this claim that Jesus wasn't really dead when he was taken down from the cross, that's got to be tested with the evidence, and it has been. So, for example, an investigative journalist by the name of Lee Strobel, who worked for the Chicago Tribune, the paper that exposed the Watergate scandal, he was a skeptic, and he was determined to find out what had happened. He really believed he could get to the bottom of all this, and he went around the whole country of America interviewing scientists, historians, medical pathologists, and he consulted a forensic pathologist, the leading one in his field, and other medical scientists as well, to get expert opinion as to how feasible this theory was. And what he found was that this theory is extremely far-fetched. There is abundant evidence by way of contemporary testimony and the testimony of non-Christians as well, that Jesus was crucified by the Romans, who knew what they were doing. They were very professional. They crucified thousands of people every year who were criminals or rebels. And they knew their gruesome business. And let's think about all that Jesus went through from a medical point of view. Even before he was arrested, Jesus knew what was coming. He was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it said that he was under extreme stress. The Gospels say that he sweated. His sweat was like great drops of blood. And this is actually a recognized medical phenomenon known as hematidrosis, where severe anxiety causes the release of chemicals that break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. And sweat comes out actually tinged with blood. And this happened to soldiers in the First World War. It was a medically recognized phenomenon.
Right.
So already you've got Jesus in a heightened state of stress. And this condition that he had would have made his skin sensitive and fragile for when he was flogged by the Roman soldiers the following day. Now, a Roman flogging was a terrible infliction of torture that killed many people in itself. The Romans used braided leather thongs with metal balls woven into it, and also parts of jagged bone was attached as well. And as the lashes were inflicted upon Jesus time after time, his whole back would have become, a quivering mass of ripped body tissue. The lacerations would have been so deep that it often went through to someone's spine when they were flogged in this way. Medics say that Jesus would have gone into hypovolemic shock, which is when a person loses lots of blood and the heart races, blood pressure drops and the kidneys stop functioning and the body craves fluids. And that's why Jesus, as it says in the Gospels, collapsed under the weight of the crossbeam. Under normal conditions, Jesus could have borne a crossbeam, but not when he had just been flogged in that way. And also explains why he was so thirsty on the cross, his body craving the fluids that had been lost. Now, Jesus was then nailed to the cross with spikes that were 5 to 7 inches long, and they were driven through his wrists, not his hands, because then the weight of his body would have torn the nails through his hands. So the Romans nailed their victims through the wrists and also through the feet. Absolute agony that would have been. And then he would have been catapulted up onto the crossbeam, slammed into that, and his arms would have been deliberately stretched out wide so that they would then dislocate. You can imagine how painful that was. And he would have had great difficulty breathing, and most crucifixion victims died of asphyxiation, being suffocation. What they needed to do was, in that position, they needed to push up with their feet so that their diaphragm could rise and they were able to breathe. But of course that would have produced unbearable agony as their feet had nails driven through them, and so they were pushing against the nails. And also Jesus' bloodied back would have been scraped against the coarse wood of the cross. Most times, as I said, victims would have died of suffocation. But sometimes death might occur earlier if there was a heart attack. And this seems to be what happened to Jesus according to the biblical evidence. As the breathing slowed, as Jesus' breathing slowed down, carbon dioxide would have stayed in the blood, and it would have dissolved as carbonic acid, causing the blood acidity to increase. And doctors call this respiratory acidosis. And that would have caused Jesus' heart to beat erratically. And Jesus would have known that he was at the moment of death because of what was happening to his heart. And that's why he was able to say, Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit. He knew he was about to die, and then he died of cardiac arrest. Now, the Jewish leaders wanted the bodies of Jesus and the two crucified people alongside him to be taken down before the Sabbath. It was a holy day. They didn't want this cursed event to be continuing over the Sabbath. So the soldiers went to break the legs of the victims to stop them pushing themselves up and being able to breathe, so that would cause suffocation and death. But when they came to Jesus, the Gospels say that the soldiers found he was already dead. Now, being Roman soldiers, they made doubly sure that he was indeed dead, and one of them drove a spear into Jesus' side. And what happened then is medical proof that John, the witness in his Gospel who refers to this, was very credible. because as Jesus' heart failed, fluid would have collected around the membrane of Jesus's heart and lungs, and so that's called pericardial and pleural effusion. And as the spear went into Jesus' side, as well as blood flowing out of Jesus, this effusion, this fluid that looked like water because it was clear, would have flowed out. And John, the apostle, wouldn't have understood the medical significance of this, but the fact that he reports blood and water flowing from Jesus' side is evidence of his credibility, and that Jesus was indeed dead of a heart attack. So really the medical evidence is that Jesus had to be definitely dead. The idea really that after all he'd gone through, he merely swooned and then revived on the third day, got up in the corners of the tomb, sort of rolled the stone away, got past the guards, and then appeared to everyone in such a way as to convince them that he was fully alive, that he'd overcome death, rather than appearing like an emaciated wreck of a human being on his last legs. I mean, that's much more incredible, really, than what Christianity claims, I think.
Okay. So, if Jesus was crucified, there's really no doubt that he was dead. But it's perhaps, could it have been that it was a hoax or a legend that he actually rose again? The disciples, could they have come up with something like that between them? No one ever saw him rise from the tomb. They claim to have seen him later. Could it have been that actually, he didn't rise? His body was eaten by wild dogs or something.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, some people have claimed this. Obviously. It's true that no one was in the tomb and actually witnessed Jesus rising up, disentangling himself from the grave clothes, rolling the stone away and walking out. But of course, no one else would have been there. Let's think about all the evidence, really. The early Christians testified with certainty, with very quickly after the crucifixion, that Jesus had been dead and buried in a tomb, Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. So it wasn't like Jesus' body was dumped somewhere, as often crucifixion victims were, to be eaten by dogs, or vultures or whatever. No, everyone claimed that Joseph of Arimathea took the body, buried it in his tomb. And Joseph was a member of the Jewish ruling council. He'd not been present when Jesus was condemned. He was actually a sympathizer of Jesus. Now, if Jesus had not been properly buried in a tomb, there'd have been loads of people who could have rubbished the claim that he was buried in a tomb. And they'd have said, oh no, his body was dumped in the refuge, with all the refuge collection, and then got eaten by rats and stuff. No, nobody disputed, even the people who very much wanted to deny that Jesus had been raised from the dead. None of them disputed that he was properly buried in Joseph's tomb. So the disciples wouldn't have been able to get away with a blatant lie if that was not the case. Everyone knew Jesus' body had been buried, and they knew where it was buried. Now, courts of law all over the world have to try and establish the facts in cases where people have died a violent death. So, for example, when someone's accused of murder, there are often no people claiming to be eyewitnesses. Often the only eyewitness would have been the person accused, and they're not going to testify against themselves, or the victim, and they're dead. So what the court has to do is to look at all the evidence and try and establish the medical cause and the time of death. It has to look at the forensic evidence of clues at the scene, whether there's fingerprints or DNA, and also lawyers have to look at the whole question of motive and opportunity and the credibility of any alibi that the accused might offer. And actually, numerous people are convicted of the crime of murder without anyone actually seeing them kill their victim, but they are convicted beyond reasonable doubt in this way. And I think it's the same with the resurrection. Obviously, no one's in the tomb there to see Jesus rise up, so we have to look at the surrounding evidence. And there's strong evidence that the tomb where Jesus was laid on the Friday was empty the following Sunday morning. No one could produce Jesus' body. The Jewish authorities had to make up a story that somehow the disciples had stolen the body, and they bribed the guards to say that they were asleep. And they said, look, don't worry, you won't get into trouble. Roman soldiers would be killed if they had fallen asleep on duty. But the Jewish authorities said, no, we'll sort it out with your commanding officer. But you're to say the disciples stole the body while we were asleep. And so no one could produce the body. Many people then claimed to have seen Jesus alive. The disciples were transformed from being fearful cowards. Most of them had run away. They were changed from being scaredy cats to people who were bold enough to turn the world upside down. And all were eventually martyred. And would they really have been willing to do all of this when they didn't have to give their whole lives for something that they knew wasn't true, that they hadn't really seen the risen Jesus because they'd made the whole thing up? So it does seem, that the overwhelming evidence is that Jesus was buried, the tomb was empty, and the disciples had no reason to claim that he was alive and risk their lives unless he was.
Yeah, that does seem unlikely. But what if someone did steal the body and the disciples genuinely convinced themselves through groupthink that he had risen again? I mean, some people do see hallucinations when they're grieving. Could it have been that it was just in their imagination?
Well, let's submit these theories to rigorous analysis, and that's what lots of people have done over the years, just as a court of law would. So if the claim is that someone stole the body, then you have to find an answer to who that might have been, what their motive might have been, and whether they had the opportunity to do it. So first of all, who would have had a motive to steal Jesus' body? The Jewish authorities had no motive. Jesus' disappearing was the last thing they wanted, as it could lead to rumours that Jesus was alive and a load more trouble for them. And that's the very reason they asked Pilate to post a guard of soldiers, according to the Gospels. If for some reason they did take the body, let's imagine they were afraid that the disciples would steal it, so they decided to get there first and take it. Then, apart from being far-fetched, as soon as the disciples started to claim Jesus was alive, all the Jewish authorities would have had to have done to squash these rumours was to produce the body. So they didn't have the body. Would the disciples have stolen the body? Well, why would they have had a motive for doing that? Jesus had a decent burial, a respectful burial place. Why would they want to move him? If we're following the hoax theory, are we to suppose that having been terrified, having been heartbroken because of Jesus' execution, that they somehow managed to sort of rally together, come up with a plan to hoax the entire world by stealing the body and claiming that Jesus had risen? They then had enough guts to overpower this Roman guard and to roll the stone back and nick the body, and then managed to hide it successfully while proceeding to deliberately create and sustain with complete unanimity a false religion that cost them all their lives in the end. I don't think that's likely. And then what about grave robbers, people might say? Well, there are accounts of grave robbers in places like Egypt, where pharaohs were buried with lots of treasure. You can understand why people might want to break in. But Jesus wasn't buried with anything valuable. And also there was an armed Roman guard, squads of 4 soldiers at a time, armed. So it's very unlikely that any grave robber would have had the desire or the opportunity to take Jesus' body.
Okay. What about if a gospel account of the guards on the tomb weren't accurate? I think it's Matthew's gospel. I mean, what if it wasn't accurate and there actually wasn't a guard there? So that was sort of more potentially viable. Yeah,
well, again, let's submit that to scrutiny as a historian would. Reading Matthew's gospel, is it likely that there was a guard if Matthew said there was? Well, if there wasn't a guard, when the first disciples preached and proclaimed the resurrection, the Jewish leaders would have said, well, you stole the body, didn't you, you disciples? And you're pretending that Jesus is risen. And the disciples would have then answered, well, no, we couldn't steal the body because there was an armed guard, a Roman guard. And then the authorities, Jewish authorities, would have said, what do you mean? There weren't any guards. If there had been no guards, the authorities could have easily suggested that the disciples had stolen the body. So actually Matthew's gospel makes sense, that in order to forestall this very outcome, the Jewish authorities arranged Roman security so that the disciples could not steal the body and claim a resurrection.
Okay. So what about the reported resurrection appearances? Could they have just been hallucinations or legendary sort of inventions? Is something someone's dreamt up?
Yeah, okay. Well, let's take the hallucinations point first. Again, psychologists have been consulted over this, have given expert evidence. And they say, no, it couldn't have been. Hallucinations are something that are experiences that are very personal to individual people based on their own particular psychological states. So hallucinations do happen, but they don't happen to a whole group of people at the same time, who are not all on the same drug and having the same experience. So the disciples were ordinary people. They were a range of characters. They were down to earth, ordinary working guys, many of them. They were not prone to sort of some mass hysteria and it's just psychologically, it's regarded as impossible for all these people to have the same hallucination at the same time. Now, as regards the legend theory, that somehow, one thing led to another, and eventually you had a legend that, like the legend of Robin Hood, or that Jesus actually did rise from the dead and all was happy ever after. Those who are expert in the development of myths and legends in history say that there is no example of any myth or legend developing earlier than 200 years after the events they're supposed to refer to. Legends take a long, long time to come together. Claims that Jesus was alive and had risen from the dead, however, were being made, 3 days after Jesus was crucified. And within just a few years, the original verbal testimony that Jesus was alive was being used as an official creed in the church, and Paul was writing about it in his first letters, like to the Corinthians. There was simply no time for a legend to develop that had no solid basis in fact. Anything made up by the disciples could have been easily discredited by those who were around at the time. It was just days, weeks, 2 or 3 years in the case of the written testimony afterwards, and plenty of people who were around to say, no, it didn't happen like that.
So how would you sum up all the evidence for the resurrection?
Right, okay, well, I think that you've got a solid case for it. And in fact, legal people down through the years, including judges and barristers, have said that they are completely convinced that there's a really good case for the resurrection, that it would stand up in a court of law. And the reasons are the following. I can list 7 reasons that have convinced the foremost sort of intelligent minds of the ages, people, scientists, medical people, lawyers, people who are used to sifting evidence. First of all, there's overwhelming historical evidence that Jesus was crucified and was dead and buried. Not just the Christians who've said that, but non-Christian sources as well. As we said a few weeks ago, the Roman historian Tacitus and a Jewish historian Josephus, they said Jesus was crucified and buried. Secondly, there's overwhelming evidence that Jesus' tomb really was empty 3 days after Good Friday. Nobody has ever discovered a body, and no satisfactory theory has ever been produced to explain what happened to Jesus' body if it didn't rise from the dead. Thirdly, the testimonies of the many different people who say they saw the risen Jesus are coherent and credible. Ordinary frightened people became emboldened. They had a complete character change and became emboldened to preach the resurrection and base their whole lives on it and turn the world upside down. They braved torture and death. People don't do that for something that they know is false. People might sincerely believe something that is wrong, but they don't give their lives for something that they know for certain in their own minds is false. The accounts of appearances to over 500 of Jesus' followers were made very early on and could have been easily challenged by those still living if they were false. So that's 3 reasons. Fourthly, it wasn't just the disciples who came to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. So James, who became a leader in the early church, he was Jesus' brother. But while Jesus was alive before his crucifixion, in his ministry, James, like the other brothers, didn't believe in Jesus. But afterwards, after the crucifixion, he then came to believe that Jesus was alive. He had risen from the dead, and he became a leading apostle. Of course, the greatest missionary, Paul, the arch enemy of Christianity, testified that he saw the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, and he spent his whole life spreading that news throughout the world. Fifthly, there is the impact that these claims made on the Jewish religion. Now, the Jewish faith has remarkably been kept alive for millennia. There's no other historical group that has survived like the Jewish people. So today we don't, have the Babylonians and the Persians and the Ammonites and the Hittites and the Jebusites. But the Jewish people are still a people, and that's because of their customs, their traditions, their laws, which are incredibly important to Jewish people. But for those Jews who believed in Jesus, they were happy to change all their customs. So instead of meeting together on the Sabbath on the Saturday, their Sabbath became the Sunday, the day that Jesus had risen from the dead. The Jews who believed in Jesus no longer performed the sacrifices that they were told to in the Jewish law, because they saw Jesus as his death and resurrection as being the fulfillment of all sacrifice. They also saw keeping the Jewish law as no longer of primary importance. The primary important thing was to have faith in Christ. And they'd always been taught to believe that the Messiah would be a great military political figure who would drive out the Romans and rule the country. But Jesus obviously wasn't like that, but they accepted him as the Messiah on the basis that he had won a victory over death, that he'd risen from the dead. Had he not done that, there's no way they could have accepted him as the Messiah. And furthermore, they ascribed divine status to Jesus. They worshipped him as God, and that was something no faithful Jew could have contemplated unless there was compelling evidence that it was true, and that resurrection provided that. Sixthly, think about how the early Christians worshipped. They baptized people, and baptism is all about the symbolism, going down into the water, symbolizing death to the old life, and then rising again up out of the water, just as Jesus died and rose. Also, the early church practiced Holy Communion, also known as the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. And that is all about marking Jesus' death, the giving of his body and blood. And we're so used to this today that we forget how strange that would have seemed to those in the first century. Because let's think about what might be a modern equivalent. Imagine a group of people getting together to remember the life of famous people who were killed, like Mahatma Gandhi or JF Kennedy or John Lennon. And imagine they get together. You would probably expect them to do things like recount the speeches that they made, the things that they said, their achievements and successes. In John Lennon's case, his music. But we think it would be extremely odd if when they got together, instead of doing all of that, they actually celebrated the fact that their bodies were broken and their blood was shed, and they were murdered. But Christians celebrated Jesus' death because of the resurrection. Crucifixion Friday became Good Friday after Easter Sunday came along. It transformed a day of defeat into a day of victory. Finally, the seventh reason is, how can you explain otherwise the growth of the worldwide church? Within about 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion, the belief that Jesus was alive had reached Rome, the capital of the world's biggest empire hitherto, most powerful empire. And if anyone had been asked before Jesus was born if the Roman Empire would be outlasted by a new community of ragtag people bound together by a Jewish carpenter turned rabbi, they would have said the idea was nuts. Yet that's what happened. Millions worship Jesus today, not because his teaching was so good, although it obviously was good, but because Jesus is alive and he's not dead. That's the belief that holds Christianity together.
Yeah, I suppose the whole thing's become so big. The faith, has spread in such a way. But if it was just some conspiracy, it wouldn't have been able to continue in that same vein, would it? So Jesus died, and Jesus rose again. So he died on the cross. We've explored that. He rose. There was no body. What happened to him in the time between the death and the resurrection? Where was his spirit?
Okay, well, this is quite a difficult one. I really don't think that the Bible tells us anything about the time between Good Friday and Easter Sunday from Jesus' perspective. Obviously, from the disciples' perspective, it was a time of grief, of waiting until the Sabbath was over, and then the women disciples decided to go and anoint the body. But from Jesus' perspective, I suppose there is a passage in the letter of 1 Peter chapter 3 where Peter talks about Jesus being put to death in the body but being made alive by the Spirit, through whom he goes and preaches to the spirits in prison who disobeyed long ago when the ark was being built by Noah. Now that's a notoriously difficult passage to understand. My own view is that is actually not talking about Jesus from Jesus' perspective during those 3 days, that somehow it was during that time that Jesus' soul or spirit went and preached. I think it's simply saying that Jesus was made alive by the same Holy Spirit that has been present throughout history, including witnessing to the people of Noah's day. That's my own view. I may be wrong on that, and I don't want to be too dogmatic about it. But my view really is that the Bible doesn't tell us anything from Jesus' perspective. And I think that it could well be similar to when we die, in that if we believe that we are raised to life, and that when Jesus returns, then the moment we die, time ceases to have any significance for us, and we wake up into eternity. And I think I think after Jesus died, the next thing that he was humanly conscious of was being raised. And so I'm not sure his soul or his spirit went anywhere.
Okay. Thank you. Have we got any other questions, Jonathan?
Just one. What do you think of Jesus being pierced in the side?
Well, I think that that was recorded by John in his gospel, and I think, as I've already said, that in what happened as a result of that, the blood and the water, or the clear fluid coming from Jesus' side, indicated the medical process of his heart giving way, and increases the credibility of John's eyewitness account. I also think that fulfills prophecy, because Isaiah speaks about the one who was to come, who would be pierced for our transgressions. So I think that that's significant, both from a medical point of view, a historical witness reliability point of view, and also from the fulfillment of prophecy.
Very good, very good. I don't see any other people, anybody else asking questions, but we always live in hope that they'll type them in there.
Yeah, do feel free to send questions in. Keeps me on my toes, and it means that I have to think quickly and carefully.
Well, if anybody asks questions later, they can still post them in the chat. Post on the Facebook, and you can answer them in future, maybe.
Yep.
Great. Martin, one more question. If people want to know more, how can they get in contact with the church?
Yeah, well, of course, come to church on a Sunday morning, services at 9 o'clock and 10:30, on a Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock here. You can also go onto our website, and there you can send us a message. So the website is www.holyspiritbedgrove.org, and you can send us a message, and we'd be delighted to hear from you and get in touch.
Brilliant. Thanks, Martin. That was absolutely fascinating. I've learned a lot, as I usually do when I sit here with you doing this. Answered some really great questions. I'm sure people do have more questions. So again, please do put them in the comments box whenever you get them. And keep your eye out for our next Ask the Vicar. We're going to be doing more of these to explore more topics. We don't know what the next one will be yet, so we will see, and we'll have a think and we'll see. Yeah. But I suppose that depends on the questions we might get in the meantime as well.
Well, I'd like to do a special one on Christmas.
Okay, yeah.
Were there really three wise men?
Okay, yeah. Well, I'd be up for doing one for Christmas. Special Christmas edition.
Christmas special.
If anybody has suggestions, they can post them on Facebook and YouTube.
There you go. Great. Excellent. Well, thanks for watching, guys, and see you soon.
See you.